The stained glass windows cast vibrant patterns across the empty pews, their beauty lost on me as I sat slumped forward, my hands trembling. My eyes were red and swollen, the tears coming in waves I couldn't control. This church had been a place of comfort once, a sanctuary Lauren and I had visited often. Now, it felt like a mockery, its silence amplifying the chaos in my mind. It wasn't just the betrayal that shattered me. It was the web of lies I'd only begun to unravel. 3 weeks ago, Lauren had given birth to a beautiful baby boy. We'd named him Caleb, and the moment I held him, I thought my life was complete. But a single envelope, small, plain, unassuming, had destroyed everything. Inside was a letter addressed to me. No sender, no signature. She's been lying to you. Caleb isn't yours. Ask for a paternity test if you don't believe me. At first, I dismissed it as a cruel joke. Lauren and I had been married for 5 years. She'd struggled with infertility, and Caleb had been nothing short of a miracle. There was no way the child wasn't mine, but the seed of doubt had been planted. I tried to ignore it, tried to focus on the joy of fatherhood. But something about the letter gnawed at me, especially as I noticed Lauren's unease. She was distant, avoiding eye contact, brushing off questions about Caleb's early doctor visits. And then I found the messages. It had been late at night, Lauren asleep in our bed. Her phone buzzed, a single notification lighting up the screen. Dr. Bennett, I miss you. Call me when you can. My heart sank. Dr. Bennett had been Lauren's OB-GYN throughout the pregnancy. He'd been professional, kind, and reassuring, at least that's what I thought. I couldn't stop myself from looking. The conversation thread went back months, filled with flirtatious texts, secret rendezvous, and the unmistakable language of lovers. That's when I realized the letter wasn't a cruel prank. It was the truth. Caleb wasn't my son. Back in the church, the weight of the revelation crushed me. I had confronted Lauren 2 days ago, desperate for an explanation. Instead, I got more lies. You're being ridiculous, Adam, she'd said, her tone sharp. Why would you even think something like that? I told her about the letter, the texts, the late nights when she'd said she was working. Her face paled, but she didn't admit to anything. You're paranoid, she snapped. You're ruining this for us. But her anger couldn't hide the truth in her eyes. I leaned back in the pew, my breath shaky. I hadn't told Lauren yet, but I'd already scheduled the paternity test. The results were due tomorrow, but I didn't need them to know what they'd say. Caleb wasn't mine, and Lauren had betrayed me in the worst way imaginable. I clenched my fists, the grief giving way to something darker. I wasn't just going to let her get away with this. The next morning, I woke to the sound of Caleb crying in his bassinet. Lauren was already up, her soft shushing barely audible through the bedroom door. Normally, I'd jump out of bed to help, but not today. I stayed where I was, staring at the ceiling, my mind consumed by what the day would bring. The paternity test results were due by noon. I had them sent to a private email, one Lauren didn't know about. She thought I was paranoid, that I was spiraling. She didn't know I was preparing for the inevitable. By the time the email arrived, my hands were shaking so badly I could barely type my password. The subject line read, Paternity test results for Adam Connolly and Caleb Connolly. I hesitated, my finger hovering over the mouse. This was it, the confirmation that would shatter any lingering hope I might have had. I clicked. The results were clear. Exclusion of paternity, 99.9%. I felt the air leave my lungs, my body sinking deeper into the chair. I stared at the screen, the words blurring as tears filled my eyes. It was one thing to suspect, to piece together the clues. It was another to have the truth staring back at me, undeniable and cold. Caleb wasn't my son. The grief hit first, a crushing wave that left me gasping for air. All the nights I'd stayed up feeding him, the hours spent imagining our future together. They were all a lie. But as the grief began to subside, anger took its place. Lauren hadn't just lied about the affair. She'd let me believe Caleb was mine. She'd let me fall in love with him, knowing the truth all along. I clenched my fists, the rage boiling just beneath the surface. I wasn't going to let her get away with this. I closed the laptop and stood, pacing the room. My mind raced with questions. Who was the real father? How long had she been seeing him? And why had she gone to such lengths to keep it hidden? I didn't know the answers yet, but I was determined to find out. Lauren's voice called from the living room. Adam, can you grab Caleb's blanket from the dryer? The sound of her voice, so casual, so normal, made my blood boil. How could she act like everything was fine, like she hadn't torn my life apart? I walked into the living room, forcing a neutral expression. Lauren was sitting on the couch, cradling Caleb in her arms. She looked up at me, her eyes tired but warm. Thanks, she said as I handed her the blanket. I didn't respond. Instead, I stared at Caleb, his tiny hand wrapped around Lauren's finger. He looked so innocent, so perfect. And yet, he wasn't mine. I turned and left the room, the anger bubbling inside me like a volcano about to erupt. She was going to pay for what she'd done. I just needed a plan. I spent the next few hours locked in my home office. The paternity test result open on one screen and Lauren's text thread with Dr. Bennett on another. The pieces were starting to fit together, but there were still gaps. Questions I needed answered before I confronted her. Who was the real father? And how long had this affair been going on? I scrolled through their messages, searching for clues. Most of their texts were flirty and vague, but one stood out. Dr. Bennett, I'm glad we're finally on the same page. Caleb will have the best of everything, I promise. My stomach churned. He knew. He knew Caleb was his, and Lauren had let him believe that while convincing me the child was mine. I leaned back in my chair, my mind spinning. Was Caleb's birth part of their plan? Had Lauren intended to cut me out of the picture eventually, or was I just a convenient cover for their affair? My chest tightened as the anger bubbled up again. I wasn't going to sit by and let them get away with this. Later that night, I waited for Lauren to fall asleep before grabbing her phone from the nightstand. It was a risk. She'd been extra cautious since I confronted her about the messages, but I needed answers. Her recent calls list was exactly what I expected. My number, her mom, a few friends, and Dr. Bennett. But one call stood out, a number I didn't recognize, dialed multiple times over the past week. I copied the number into my phone and slipped hers back onto the nightstand. The next morning, while Lauren fed Caleb in the kitchen, I called the number. A woman answered, her voice brisk and professional. Dr. Bennett's office. How can I help you? My heart raced. Hi, I'm calling about a recent visit Lauren Connolly had. I'm her husband, and I have a few questions about her appointments. The receptionist hesitated. I'm sorry, sir, but I can't disclose patient information without consent. I expected that. I understand, I said quickly, trying to sound calm. But I'm just wondering if there's been anything unusual. Lauren's been acting strange, and I'm worried about her. The woman sighed. I'm sorry, but I can't help you. The line went dead, and I slammed my phone down in frustration. If I couldn't get answers through the front door, I'd have to find another way. I sat back, my mind racing. The texts, the paternity test, the suspicious phone calls. It was all leading back to Dr. Bennett. And if he thought he could keep hiding behind Lauren, he was in for a rude awakening. That evening, I told Lauren I had to work late. She nodded absently, too focused on Caleb to notice my tension. But I wasn't going to the office. I was going to Dr. Bennett's clinic. The parking lot was nearly empty when I arrived, the building dark except for a single light in one of the back offices. I parked a few spaces away and waited, my eyes fixed on the illuminated window. An hour passed before the light went out, and the door opened. Dr. Bennett stepped outside, his phone pressed to his ear. I clenched the steering wheel, my pulse pounding in my ears. This was the man who'd betrayed me, who'd pretended to be a professional while destroying my family behind the scenes. As he walked toward his car, I got out, my footsteps deliberate and heavy. Dr. Bennett, I called, my voice cold. He froze, turning to face me. His eyes widened in recognition, but he quickly composed himself. Mr. Connolly, he said smoothly. What a surprise. I stopped a few feet away, my fists clenched at my sides. We need to talk. He tilted his head, feigning confusion. About what? About Caleb, I said, my voice shaking with barely contained rage. And about how you've been lying to me this whole time. For a moment, something flickered in his expression, guilt, maybe, or fear, but it was gone as quickly as it came. I'm afraid I don't know what you're talking about, he said, his tone measured. Don't lie to me, I snapped, stepping closer. I've seen the texts. I know the truth. Dr. Bennett sighed, slipping his hands into his pockets. Look, Adam, I understand you're upset, but this isn't the place to discuss personal matters. Why don't we set up a time to talk privately? I laughed bitterly, shaking my head. You think I'm going to let you control the narrative? No, you don't get to hide anymore. He started to respond, but I cut him off. And don't worry, I'm not just here to talk to you. I'm going to make sure everyone knows exactly what you and Lauren have done. Dr. Bennett's calm demeanor faltered, and for the first time, I saw a real fear in his eyes. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. Dr. Bennett stared at me, his calm facade cracking as my words hung in the air. He opened his mouth to respond, but I didn't give him the chance. You've been hiding behind Lauren, behind your profession, I said, stepping closer. But the lies stopped now. His jaw tightened, and he glanced around the empty parking lot as if weighing his options. Finally, he raised his hands, a placating gesture. Adam, he said softly, his tone shifting to one of practiced empathy. I know this is difficult for you, but you're angry at the wrong person. I blinked, caught off guard by the audacity. Excuse me? He sighed, slipping into the polished demeanor of someone used to defusing tense situations. Lauren made her choices. I didn't force her into anything. If anything, she came to me. My fists clenched at my sides, and I took a step forward, my voice trembling with rage. Don't you dare put this on her. You knew she was married. You knew she was vulnerable, and you took advantage of her. Dr. Bennett's expression shifted again, a flicker of frustration crossing his face. You think I'm the villain here? He snapped, his voice low. You're the one who failed her, Adam. She came to me because she felt invisible, unappreciated. Maybe you should take a hard look in the mirror before pointing fingers. His words were like gasoline on a fire. I lunged forward, grabbing the lapels of his jacket, forcing him against the side of his car. You don't get to twist this, I hissed. You destroyed my family. You're a fraud, a coward, and I'm going to make sure everyone knows it. For a moment, Dr. Bennett looked genuinely afraid. Then his lips curled into a cold smirk. Go ahead, he said. Tell whoever you want. But be careful, Adam. You might not like what you uncover. His words sent a chill down my spine, but I didn't let go. What's that supposed to mean? He shrugged, his smirk widening. Just that you don't know the whole story. And when you do, you might wish you'd left it alone. I released him, shoving him back against the car. Stay away from my family, I said, my voice low and dangerous. He straightened his jacket, brushing imaginary dust off his sleeves. I'm not the one who needs to stay away. Lauren's already made her choice. I turned and walked away, my chest heaving with fury. His smug tone echoed in my mind, but it only strengthened my resolve. Whatever he was hiding, I was going to find it. That night, I confronted Lauren. She was in the kitchen, feeding Caleb, when I stormed in, slamming the door behind me. Did you know? I demanded, my voice shaking. She froze, her face pale. Know what? That Dr. Bennett thinks he has the upper hand, I snapped. That he's hiding something even bigger than this affair. Lauren's eyes darted away, her hands trembling as she set Caleb's bottle down. Adam, I don't know what you're talking about. Don't lie to me, I said, slamming my hand on the counter. You've been lying to me for months, and now he's telling me there's more. What is it, Lauren? Her silence spoke volumes, and for a moment, I thought she might confess. But then her expression hardened, and she crossed her arms. This is ridiculous, she said. You're letting your anger cloud your judgment. You're looking for something that isn't there. Her deflection only fueled my suspicion. You think I'm just going to let this go? I asked, my voice rising. You think I'm going to ignore the fact that my wife has been lying to me about everything, including my own son? Lauren flinched, but she didn't respond. I shook my head, the anger giving way to a crushing sense of betrayal. You're unbelievable, I said, turning to leave. Adam, wait, she called after me, her voice cracking. Please don't do this. Let's just talk. But I didn't stop. I didn't want to talk. I wanted the truth. I left the house, the door slamming behind me as Lauren's voice called after me. I couldn't stay there another second, not with the lies stacking higher and the truth slipping further out of reach. Dr. Bennett's cryptic words rattled in my mind. You don't know the whole story. What else could there be? I needed answers, and I knew just where to start. I drove straight to the clinic, my knuckles white as I gripped the steering wheel. It was late, but I knew the cleaning staff would still be there. I'd seen them finishing up when I confronted Dr. Bennett the night before. As I pulled into the parking lot, I spotted a woman wheeling a trash bin toward the back door. "Excuse me," I called, stepping out of the car. She turned, startled, her expression wary. "I'm looking for some files," I said, trying to sound casual. "Dr. Bennett asked me to grab something for him, but the office was locked when I got here." Her eyes narrowed, but after a moment, she nodded. "He's always leaving things behind. Come on." She led me inside, flipping on the lights. The clinic was eerily quiet, the sterile smell of disinfectant hanging in the air. "You have 5 minutes," she said, handing me a keyring. "Make it quick." "Thank you," I said, slipping into Dr. Bennett's office. The room was meticulously organized, every file and object in its place. I scanned the shelves, looking for anything with Lauren's name on it. Finally, I found a folder labeled Connolly Lauren. My hands trembled as I opened it, flipping through the pages. Most of it was standard medical information, appointments, test results, but one document caught my eye. It was a signed consent form, dated a few weeks before Caleb was born. The procedure listed was a non-invasive paternity test. I stared at the paper, my heart pounding. Lauren had known all along that Caleb wasn't mine. She hadn't just suspected. She confirmed it before our son was even born. The lies were deeper than I'd imagined. I stuffed the folder back on the shelf and was about to leave when another name caught my eye. Bennett Evan. Curiosity got the better of me, and I pulled the folder down. Inside were patient records, not his but a woman's. The name was unfamiliar, but the notes made my stomach drop. Dr. Bennett had performed a similar paternity test for another woman just months before Lawrence. The child's father was listed as Dr. Bennett himself. This wasn't the first time he'd done this. I left the clinic with my head spinning, the implications hitting me like a freight train. Dr. Bennett wasn't just a cheater. He was a predator, using his position to manipulate vulnerable women. And Lauren had been one of them. When I got home, Lauren was waiting in the living room, her face pale. "Where were you?" she asked, her voice trembling. "I know everything," I said, holding up the folder. "You knew Caleb wasn't mine before he was even born. And you lied to me anyway." Her face crumpled, and she buried her head in her hands. "Adam, I didn't know what to do. I was scared." "Scared?" I snapped. "Scared of what? Of losing your perfect little facade? Of me finding out the truth?" She shook her head, her sobs muffled. "Of him," she whispered. Her words stopped me cold. "What do you mean, of him?" Lauren looked up, her eyes red and swollen. "Dr. Bennett," she said. He made me do it." "What are you talking about?" I asked, my voice low and dangerous. "He said if I told you the truth, he'd ruin me," she cried. "He'd tell everyone about the affair, about Caleb. He said no one would believe me, that I'd lose everything." Her confession hit me like a punch to the gut. Dr. Bennett hadn't just betrayed me. He'd manipulated Lauren, using fear to keep her silent. But now his leverage was gone. Lauren's confession hung in the air, her sobs the only sound in the room. I stood frozen, my mind racing as I tried to process her words. Dr. Bennett had threatened her. He controlled her, and I'd been blind to it all. "Start from the beginning," I said, my voice sharper than I intended. "What exactly did he say to you?" She wiped her face with trembling hands, her voice barely above a whisper. "It started when I went to him about our fertility problems. He was kind at first, supportive, but then he started making comments, telling me I deserved more, that I deserved to feel wanted." I clenched my fists, my jaw tightening. "And you believed him?" Lauren looked away, guilt etched into every line of her face. "I was vulnerable, Adam. We were struggling, and I felt lost. He made me feel like I wasn't broken, like I was still worth something." Her words stung, but I forced myself to focus. "And when you got pregnant? That's when everything changed," she said, her voice cracking. "I told him it was his, and he didn't care. He said I had to tell you it was yours, that no one could ever know the truth." I took a step back, the weight of her words pressing down on me. "And you went along with it." "I didn't know what else to do," she cried. "He said he'd destroy me if I didn't. He said he'd take everything, my reputation, my career, even Caleb." I stared at her, my chest tightening with a mix of anger and pity. "You let him control you," I said, my voice trembling. "You let him ruin our family." Lauren broke down, covering her face with her hands. "I know," she sobbed. "I know I should have told you the truth. But I was so scared, Adam. I didn't want to lose you." Her tears didn't move me this time. I turned and walked to the window, staring out into the dark street. Dr. Bennett wasn't just a cheater. He was a manipulator, a man who preyed on women when they were at their weakest. And now, he thought he could walk away unscathed. But he was wrong. The next morning, I called my lawyer. I explained everything: Lauren's affair, the paternity test, and Dr. Bennett's threats. I want him exposed, I said. I don't care what it takes. My lawyer hesitated. This could get messy, Adam. He's a respected doctor. Are you sure you want to go after him? Messy doesn't scare me, I replied. He doesn't get to ruin lives and walk away. Not this time. The first step was filing a formal complaint with the medical board. I gathered every piece of evidence I had: the texts, the paternity test, even Lauren's signed consent form for the test Dr. Bennett had orchestrated. The next step was ensuring his other victims came forward. Lauren was reluctant at first, but after hours of talking, she finally agreed to speak out. I don't want anyone else to go through what I did, she said quietly. Her bravery surprised me, but it wasn't enough to mend what had been broken between us. By the end of the week, the investigation was in full swing. The medical board subpoenaed records from Dr. Bennett's clinic, and whispers of his misconduct began to spread. I could see the cracks forming in his carefully constructed facade. But I wasn't done yet. The wheels were in motion, and Dr. Bennett's world was beginning to unravel. The complaint I filed with the medical board had forced an investigation into his practice, but that wasn't enough for me. I didn't just want accountability, I wanted justice. Lauren had been hesitant to share more, but I needed her cooperation to strengthen the case. That evening, I sat her down at the kitchen table, my tone firm but calm. If you really want to fix this, I said, then you have to be honest about everything. Not just with me, but with the investigators. They need to know exactly how far this went. She nodded, her eyes downcast. I'll tell them everything, she said softly. But, Adam, this doesn't fix us, does it? Her question hit me harder than I expected. I hesitated before replying. I don't know. Her lip trembled, but she didn't push further. The next day, we met with my lawyer to prepare a statement for the board. Lauren detailed her relationship with Dr. Bennett, recounting how he had manipulated her into secrecy and coerced her into hiding Caleb's true parentage. By the time she finished, she was visibly shaken, but there was a glimmer of relief in her eyes, like a weight had been lifted. Do you think this will be enough? She asked the lawyer. It's a strong start, he replied, but we'll need corroboration. If there are other women, their stories could seal this. That was the next step, finding others who'd suffered under Dr. Bennett's manipulation. Lauren reluctantly agreed to reach out to women she'd seen him interact with at the clinic, subtly probing for any signs they'd experienced similar behavior. It didn't take long before one woman responded, a former patient who'd stopped seeing Dr. Bennett abruptly after a series of inappropriate comments. I always thought something was off about him, she said when Lauren and I met her at a cafe. But I didn't think anyone would believe me if I said anything. As more women came forward, a clear pattern began to emerge. Dr. Bennett wasn't just a cheater. He was a predator who used his position to exploit vulnerable patients. The investigation escalated quickly. By the end of the week, his clinic was raided, and the medical board suspended his license pending a formal hearing. But I still wasn't satisfied. I wanted him to feel the same sense of betrayal and humiliation he'd inflicted on me. That's when I came up with the idea. Dr. Bennett had built his reputation on trust and professionalism. I decided to dismantle it piece by piece. With the help of my lawyer and the other victims, I drafted a press release detailing the allegations against him. It wasn't just about the affair. It was about the countless lives he'd damaged with his lies and coercion. The release went public the following morning, and within hours, the fallout began. News outlets picked up the story, and social media exploded with outrage. Former patients shared their experiences, painting a damning picture of a man who had abused his position of power for years. Dr. Bennett's name was everywhere, for all the wrong reasons. Lauren watched the coverage from the couch, her expression a mix of relief and guilt. "Do you feel better now?" she asked quietly. I didn't answer. Instead, I stared at the screen, watching as the man who had destroyed my family faced the beginnings of his downfall. The morning after the press release, I woke to a flood of notifications. News outlets, blogs, and even local TV stations were all running stories about Dr. Bennett's fall from grace. One headline stood out: "Respected doctor under fire for exploiting patients, a shocking pattern of betrayal." I read through the article, every word fueling the satisfaction brewing in my chest. The man who had destroyed my family was finally being exposed for what he truly was. But the victory felt hollow. Lauren sat at the kitchen table, scrolling through her phone with a distant expression. "Everyone's talking about it," she said softly. "Even my co-workers have been messaging me." "Good," I replied, pouring a cup of coffee. "The more people know, the better." She hesitated, biting her lip. What if this backfires?" I set the mug down harder than I intended. "Backfires? Lauren, he's the one who did this. Not me. Not us. Him." Her eyes filled with tears, but she nodded. "I know. I can't help but feel responsible." I wanted to snap at her, to remind her that she'd played a part in this mess. But the truth was, I couldn't entirely blame her. Dr. Bennett had manipulated her, just as he'd done to others. Still, her guilt wasn't my problem. Not anymore. That afternoon, I received a call from Carol, one of the women who had come forward. "You need to see this," she said, her voice tense. "Check your email." I opened my inbox to find a forwarded message, a threat from Dr. Bennett's legal team. The email was blunt. "Cease and desist all defamatory statements regarding Dr. Evan Bennett. Failure to comply will result in immediate legal action." I forwarded the email to my lawyer, my hands shaking with fury. "He's scared," my lawyer said when I called. "This is a desperation move. He knows the damage is already done." "Then why does it feel like he still has the upper hand?" I asked. "Because you're letting him get to you," he replied. "Stay focused. The truth is on your side." I hung up, trying to shake the unease creeping over me. Dr. Bennett was losing, but the way he'd smirked at me in the parking lot still haunted me. He was hiding something big. That evening, I went for a walk to clear my head. The cool air helped, but my thoughts kept circling back to one question. What was Dr. Bennett's endgame? By the time I got home, I had a sinking feeling that the worst was yet to come. Lauren was waiting for me in the living room, Caleb asleep in her arms. She looked up as I walked in, her expression guarded. "I need to tell you something," she said. I froze, the tension in the air palpable. "What is it?" She hesitated, her voice trembling. "Dr. Bennett, he told me something before Caleb was born." My heart sank. "What did he say?" She took a deep breath, her eyes brimming with tears. "He said, if I ever left him, he'd make sure you paid for it. That he'd ruin you, Adam." Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. "Why didn't you tell me this sooner?" I demanded. "Because I thought he was bluffing," she cried. "But now, with everything happening, I think he meant it." I paced the room, my mind racing. If Dr. Bennett had a plan to retaliate, I needed to be ready. Lauren reached out, her voice desperate. "Adam, please. You have to be careful. He's dangerous." I turned to her, my jaw clenched. "He's already ruined enough. He's not taking anything else from me." The night after Lauren's confession, I barely slept. Dr. Bennett's threat hung over me like a storm cloud, but it didn't scare me. It pissed me off. He thought he could intimidate me, control Lauren, and walk away without consequences. He'd underestimated me. By morning, I had a plan. Lauren was in the kitchen feeding Caleb when I joined her. Her face was pale, her eyes puffy from crying. "We need to talk," I said, sitting across from her. She set Caleb's bottle down, her hands trembling. "What is it?" "I need you to call him," I said bluntly. Her eyes widened in panic. "What?" "No, Adam, I can't." "You can," I interrupted. "And you will. He doesn't know we're working together now. We'll use that against him." Lauren shook her head, tears spilling down her cheeks. "I can't go back to him. I can't let him pull me in again." "You won't," I said firmly. "This isn't about him controlling you. This is about us taking control. You'll get him to meet you, somewhere public. I'll handle the rest." She hesitated, her fear palpable. But after a long pause, she nodded. "Okay, I'll do it." An hour later, Lauren stood in the living room, her phone pressed to her ear. I watched from the hallway, listening intently. "Evan," she said, her voice shaky. "We need to talk. Can you meet me tonight?" His reply was muffled, but I could hear the smugness in his tone even from a distance. "Okay," Lauren said after a long pause. "The park, near the east entrance. 8 o'clock." She hung up and turned to me, her face pale. "He'll be there." That evening, I parked a block away from the park, my hands gripping the steering wheel. Lauren was sitting beside me, her expression a mix of fear and determination. You don't have to do this, I said, glancing at her. Yes, I do, she replied, her voice steady. For you. For Caleb. For us. I nodded, my chest tightening with a mix of pride and sadness. Stick to the plan, I said. Get him talking. I'll record everything. Lauren stepped out of the car, her shoulders squared as she walked toward the park. I followed at a distance, staying in the shadows as she approached the east entrance. Dr. Bennett was already there, leaning casually against a lamppost. His smug smile made my blood boil, but I stayed hidden, my phone ready to record. Evan, Lauren said, her voice trembling. Lauren, he replied smoothly. I was wondering when you'd come back to your senses. She flinched, but she didn't back down. I'm not here to come back. I'm here because you owe me the truth. Dr. Bennett laughed softly, his arrogance palpable. The truth? You already know the truth, sweetheart. You're just too scared to face it. Lauren's voice grew stronger. You threatened me, Evan. You said you'd ruin Adam. What did you mean by that? He stepped closer, his tone turning cold. I meant exactly what I said. If he keeps pushing, he'll regret it. And Caleb? Lauren pressed. What were you planning to do with him? Dr. Bennett's expression darkened, and for a moment, I thought he might lose his composure. But then he smirked. Caleb is mine, he said. He'll always be mine. And if Adam tries to take him from me, I'll make sure he never sees that kid again. The rage bubbling inside me threatened to boil over, but I stayed silent, the recording capturing every damning word. Lauren's voice cracked. You're a monster. Dr. Bennett stepped even closer, his voice a low growl. And you're a fool if you think you can outsmart me. Lauren stepped back, her eyes flicking toward the shadows where I was hiding. It was my cue. I stepped into the light, my phone held high. You're done, Bennett. His head snapped toward me, his expression twisting into one of shock and fury. You. Save it, I said, cutting him off. I've got everything I need. The threats, the manipulation, it's all on tape. For the first time, Dr. Bennett looked genuinely afraid. He started to speak, but I held up a hand. You don't scare me, I said, my voice steady. And now, everyone will see you for what you really are. Dr. Bennett's arrogance melted away as he stood frozen, his eyes darting between me and Lauren. His smug confidence was replaced by something I hadn't expected: fear. You have no idea what you're doing, he said, his voice sharp but trembling at the edges. Oh, I think I do, I replied, holding up my phone. This recording is going straight to the authorities. You're finished. Lauren stood her ground beside me, her arms crossed. You can't manipulate your way out of this anymore, Evan. It's over. His jaw clenched, and for a moment, I thought he might try to lunge at me. But then he laughed, a short, bitter sound. You think this will stop me, he sneered. You're just scratching the surface. You have no idea how deep this goes. I stepped forward, my voice cold. Then why don't you enlighten me? Dr. Bennett smirked, his composure slipping back into place. You really think I don't have contingencies? You've made this personal, Adam, and you know what happens when people get personal? They lose. You'll lose. I felt Lauren's hand brush against mine, her silent show of support grounding me. The only person losing here is you, I said. As I turned to leave, he called out after me. You're not a real father, Adam, and you never will be. The words stung, but I didn't look back. The drive home was quiet, the weight of the confrontation hanging heavy in the car. Lauren stared out the window, her face pale. What happens now? She asked softly. I tightened my grip on the steering wheel. We keep going. We turn this over to the police, the medical board, whoever will listen. He's not getting away with this. She nodded, her expression unreadable. The next morning, I met with my lawyer to hand over the recording. This is big, he said, listening to the playback. It's exactly what we needed to strengthen the case. But his tone turned cautious. Bennett's the kind of guy who won't go down without a fight. You need to be prepared for him to strike back. I am, I said firmly. True to my lawyer's warning, Dr. Bennett didn't waste time retaliating. That evening, I received a phone call from an unknown number. When I answered, a man's voice spoke. Mr. Connolly, this is Detective Harper with the local precinct. We've received a report of alleged harassment against Dr. Evan Bennett. We'll need you to come in for questioning. I felt the air leave my lungs. Harassment? Are you kidding me? The detective's tone was professional, but firm. We're just following up on a report. Please come down to the station tomorrow. When I told Lauren, her face turned ashen. He's trying to discredit you, she said. He's going to spin this and make it look like you're the villain. I sat down heavily, the weight of it all pressing down on me. Let him try. I have the truth on my side. But even as I said it, I couldn't shake the feeling that Dr. Bennett's words weren't just empty threats. The next day at the station, Detective Harper listened patiently as I explained my side of the story, playing the recording for him. When it ended, he leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. That's compelling evidence, he said. But Bennett's countersuit complicates things. He's claiming you've been harassing him and his staff. My jaw tightened. He's lying. I believe you, Harper said. But we need to tread carefully. Cases like this can get messy fast. By the time I left the station, my frustration had boiled over. Dr. Bennett was pulling every string he could to turn the narrative in his favor. But I wasn't going to let him win. That evening, Lauren and I sat at the kitchen table, a sense of urgency hanging between us. We have to dig deeper, I said. He said this goes further than we realize. If he has skeletons in his closet, we need to find them. Lauren hesitated, then nodded. There's one thing I haven't told you, she said quietly. I raised an eyebrow. What is it? She took a deep breath, her hands trembling. Evan, he kept files. On me. On other women. He said it was for his protection, but I think he used them to blackmail us. Her revelation hit me like a sledgehammer. Where are these files? I don't know, she admitted. But they're real. If we can find them, it might be the proof we need to end this. Lauren's words reignited my determination. Dr. Bennett thought he was untouchable, but his arrogance was his weakness. He had a trail, and I was going to find it. Lauren's revelation about the files set my mind racing. Dr. Bennett wasn't just manipulative, he was methodical, calculating. If he had evidence to use as leverage over his victims, it wasn't just a power play. It was a weapon. We needed to find those files. Do you have any idea where he might keep them? I asked, my voice steady despite the storm of emotions brewing inside me. She hesitated, her brow furrowing. He was always secretive about his office. There's a locked drawer in his desk he never let anyone near. I saw him put papers in there a few times, but I never knew what they were. A locked drawer. That was the lead we needed. The problem was gaining access to his office. The clinic was under investigation, but Bennett still had some control over the premises, and the risk of being caught was high. We'll have to be careful, I said, my mind already formulating a plan. But if we can get in there, those files could be the key to bringing him down for good. Lauren looked at me, her expression a mix of fear and determination. I'll help, whatever it takes. The following evening, we parked a block away from the clinic, the darkness cloaking our movements. Lauren's anxiety was palpable as we approached the building. I never thought I'd be sneaking into a place like this, she murmured. I placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. This is the last piece of the puzzle. Once we have those files, he won't have anything left to hide behind. Lauren had managed to borrow a spare key from a former co-worker who sympathized with her situation. The clinic was eerily quiet as we stepped inside, the faint hum of fluorescent lights the only sound. She led me to Bennett's office, her footsteps hesitant but purposeful. This is it, she whispered, pointing to the large mahogany desk. I moved quickly, pulling open drawers and scanning their contents. Most were filled with standard office supplies and patient forms, but then I found it, a drawer locked with a small combination padlock. This has to be it, I said, my voice low. Lauren knelt beside me, her hands trembling as she produced a small paper clip from her pocket. I've seen him unlock it before. Let me try. Her hands worked deftly, the paper clip bending and twisting as she manipulated the lock. Within seconds, there was a soft click, and the drawer slid open. Inside were several manila folders, each labeled with a name. Lauren gasped, her eyes widening as she recognized some of them. These are his patients, she whispered. I pulled out the folder labeled Connolly, Lauren, and opened it. The contents made my stomach churn. Transcripts of text messages, photos, and detailed notes about their encounters. This is disgusting, I muttered, flipping through the pages. Another folder caught my attention. This one wasn't labeled with a name. It was simply marked contingencies. I opened it and found a list of names, each one followed by detailed information. Financial records, compromising photos, and personal secrets. He's been blackmailing people for years, I said, my voice tight with anger. This isn't just about you or me. He's built an entire empire on manipulation. We took photos of everything, ensuring we had digital copies of the most damning evidence. As we worked, Lauren's expression hardened, her fear giving way to a steely resolve. "He can't get away with this," she said. "He won't," I replied. "This is the end for him." As we prepared to leave, a sudden noise froze us in place. A door creaking opened somewhere down the hall. "Someone's here," Lauren whispered, her voice trembling. I motioned for her to stay quiet, slipping the files back into the drawer and locking it. We crept toward the back exit, my heart pounding with every step. We made it out just in time, slipping into the shadows as a figure entered the clinic. From a distance, I could see it was Dr. Bennett himself, his silhouette illuminated by the dim hallway light. My grip on Lauren's hand tightened. "Let's go," I whispered. When we got back to the car, I exhaled a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. "That was too close," Lauren said, her voice shaky. "But we got what we needed," I replied. "Now it's time to take him down for good." The next morning, I met with my lawyer, the digital copies of Dr. Bennett's files stored securely on a flash drive. Lauren had decided to stay home with Caleb, her nerves too frayed to handle another confrontation so soon. As I handed over the drive, my lawyer's eyes widened. "This is damning," he said, scrolling through the images on his laptop. "This isn't just misconduct. This is criminal." I leaned forward, my voice cold. "How fast can we move on this?" "Fast," he replied. "We'll take this to the authorities and the medical board immediately. With this kind of evidence, he doesn't stand a chance." By afternoon, the wheels were in motion. The police were contacted, and I provided my statement, detailing everything from Lauren's initial confession to the confrontation at the park and the files we'd uncovered. Detective Harper, the same officer who had called me about Bennett's harassment claims, listened intently. "You weren't lying," he said, shaking his head. "This guy's been running a racket for years. We'll take it from here." It wasn't long before the media picked up the story. Dr. Bennett, once a respected figure in the community, was now the center of a criminal investigation involving coercion, fraud, and blackmail. News anchors detailed his exploits, their voices dripping with condemnation. Dr. Evan Bennett faces allegations of exploiting vulnerable patients, falsifying medical records, and leveraging personal information for financial and emotional control, one reporter announced. Lauren and I watched the coverage from the living room, her expression a mix of relief and lingering guilt. "He's finally getting what he deserves," she said softly. I nodded, my gaze fixed on the screen. "But it's not over yet." That evening, I received a phone call from Detective Harper. "We've issued a warrant for his arrest," he said. "But Bennett's gone. His staff reported he cleared out his office this afternoon. We think he's running." A cold dread settled over me. "Do you have any leads?" "Not yet," Harper admitted. "But we'll find him. People like him always make mistakes." The idea of Bennett on the loose sent a chill down my spine. He was dangerous, not just because of his resources, but because of his arrogance. He wouldn't let this go quietly. I double-checked the locks on the doors that night, my mind racing with what-ifs. The next morning, I found a letter on the porch. The envelope was plain, my name scrawled across the front in bold handwriting. Inside was a single sheet of paper, the words chilling in their simplicity. "This isn't over, Adam. You'll pay for what you've done." I clenched the letter in my fist, my chest tightening with anger and fear. Lauren found me minutes later, my hands trembling as I held the note. "What's wrong?" she asked, her voice laced with concern. I handed her the letter. Her face went pale as she read it, her hands flying to her mouth. "Oh my God! He knows where we live." I immediately called Detective Harper, forwarding him a photo of the letter. "This just confirms he's desperate," Harper said. "But it's also reckless. We'll increase patrols near your house, and I'll have someone watching your property. Don't panic, but stay vigilant." Despite his reassurance, I couldn't shake the feeling that Bennett wasn't just posturing. He'd threatened before, and I knew he had the resources to follow through. But this time, I wasn't going to let him get the upper hand. Lauren and I spent the evening planning our next move. If Bennett wanted to play dirty, I'd be ready for him. "What if he comes here?" Lauren asked, her voice trembling. "Then we show him we're not afraid," I replied. "And we make sure this ends on our terms." The days that followed felt like an endless waiting game. Every knock on the door, Every shadow in the yard sent my heart racing. Dr. Bennett's letter had shaken us, but it also sharpened my focus. Lauren tried to maintain a sense of normalcy for Caleb's sake, but the tension in the house was palpable. The baby's cries seemed louder, the nights longer, and the silence between us heavier. On the fourth day, I received a call from Detective Harper. His tone was brisk. "We have a lead," he said. "Bennett was spotted at a motel about 30 miles from here. By the time we arrived, he was gone, but he left something behind." "What did he leave?" I asked, dread pooling in my stomach. "A folder," Harper replied. "It was addressed to you." I met Harper at the precinct that afternoon, my nerves frayed. The folder sat on his desk, unassuming and beige. "Are you ready for this?" Harper asked, his expression grim. I nodded, swallowing the lump in my throat. Inside the folder were dozens of photos. Most were surveillance-style shots of me, Lauren, and Caleb at the park outside the house, even through the windows of our living room. My stomach churned as I flipped through them, each image more invasive than the last. "He's been watching us," I said, my voice tight. Harper nodded. "It seems like he's been planning this for a while. There's also this." He handed me a handwritten note, the words scrawled hastily. "Adam, you thought you could ruin me. Now I'll show you what it feels like to lose everything." I clenched the note, my hands shaking with fury. "He's escalating. He's trying to scare us. And he's succeeding," Harper said. "But this works in our favor. His desperation makes him sloppy. We're closing in on him." When I got home, I didn't tell Lauren about the photos. She was already on edge, and I didn't want to add to her fear. Instead, I sat her down and went over our security measures again: locks, cameras, emergency contacts. "Do you think he's going to show up here?" she asked, her voice trembling. "I don't know," I admitted. "But if he does, we'll be ready." That night, I stayed up late, watching the security feeds on my laptop. The streets were quiet, the occasional car passing by the only sign of life. Around 2 a.m., my phone buzzed. It was a notification from one of the cameras, a motion alert near the backyard. My heart raced as I clicked on the live feed. At first, the screen was dark, the faint outline of the yard barely visible. Then I saw it. A figure moving near the fence, a flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. I grabbed the baseball bat I'd left by the door and crept outside, my pulse pounding in my ears. The cold night air bit at my skin as I scanned the yard, the beam of my own flashlight slicing through the shadows. "Who's there?" I called, my voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through me. The figure froze, silhouetted against the fence. For a moment, neither of us moved. Then, with a burst of speed, the intruder bolted, vaulting over the fence and disappearing into the night. I called Harper immediately, relaying what had happened. "He's testing you," Harper said, "trying to rattle you before making his next move. But we're closing the net. Just hang tight." Hanging tight wasn't an option anymore. I wasn't going to wait for Bennett to make his move. The next morning, I began making calls. Private investigators, security consultants, anyone who could give me an edge. By the end of the day, I had a plan in motion. Bennett wanted to play games, but I was done playing. That evening, I sat down with Lauren, laying everything out for her. "This ends now," I said. "I'm done waiting for him to strike. It's time we take control." She nodded, her expression resolute. "What do we need to do?" I leaned forward, my voice low and firm. "We're going to set a trap." The plan was simple, but it relied on precision. Dr. Bennett thought he was in control, that his threats and surveillance would leave us paralyzed. He didn't realize we were watching him as closely as he was watching us. Lauren was nervous but resolute. "What if it doesn't work?" she asked as we reviewed the final details. "It will," I said firmly. "We have the advantage now. He thinks we're scared. We'll use that." The bait was a carefully crafted text from Lauren's phone. "Lauren, Evan, I can't do this anymore. Adam's becoming suspicious, and I'm scared. I need to talk to you alone." We debated over the location before settling on a secluded clearing in a nearby park. It was isolated enough to make Bennett feel safe, but close enough for law enforcement to intervene when the time came. The key was making it look real. The next day, Lauren sent the text. The wait was agonizing, every minute feeling like an eternity. When her phone buzzed with Bennett's reply, my heart raced. "Dr. Bennett, tonight. Usual spot. 9 p.m. "He's taking the bait," I said, adrenaline surging through me. Lauren exhaled shakily. What happens if he doesn't show? He will, I assured her. He won't be able to resist. We coordinated with Detective Harper, who arranged for plainclothes officers to be stationed nearby. Their instructions were clear. Wait for Bennett to incriminate himself before moving in. By 8:30 p.m., the pieces were in place. Lauren and I arrived at the park, parking a short distance from the clearing. You don't have to do this, I said, my voice low. Yes, I do, she replied, her jaw set. It's the only way to end this. Lauren stepped into the clearing, her silhouette barely visible in the dim light. I stayed hidden in the shadows, my phone ready to record. Minutes passed like hours, the tension thick enough to choke on. Then, footsteps. Dr. Bennett emerged from the darkness, his confident stride a stark contrast to the predator I knew he was. Lauren, he said, his voice smooth. I knew you'd come around. She stepped back, her body language a careful balance of fear and defiance. I can't do this anymore, Evan. It's too much. He laughed softly. Too much? You knew what this was. You can't just walk away now. Not without consequences. I gripped the phone tighter, every word a nail in his coffin. What do you mean by consequences? Lauren asked, her voice trembling just enough to sell the act. Bennett stepped closer, his tone darkening. You know exactly what I mean. You and Adam have been playing games, but I hold all the cards. If you try to cross me, I'll destroy everything you care about. His words sent a chill down my spine, but I stayed hidden, letting him dig his own grave. Lauren's voice wavered. What do you want from me? Bennett smirked, reaching out to touch her arm. Just loyalty. That's all I've ever wanted. And maybe a little gratitude. Before he could say more, Detective Harper and his team emerged from the shadows, their guns drawn. Evan Bennett, you're under arrest, Harper announced. Bennett froze, his smirk evaporating as he realized what was happening. What the he started, but Harper cut him off. Save it, Harper said, stepping forward. We have enough evidence to put you away for a long time. As they cuffed Bennett, he turned to me, his eyes filled with fury. This isn't over, Adam, he snarled. You'll regret this. I stepped closer, meeting his glare. The only thing I regret is not stopping you sooner. Lauren watched silently as they led Bennett away, her shoulders sagging with relief. It's over, she said softly, tears streaming down her face. I nodded, pulling her into a hug. It's over. The days following Dr. Bennett's arrest were a whirlwind of relief and emotional exhaustion. The evidence we'd collected, along with his incriminating statements at the park, had sealed his fate. He was charged with multiple counts of coercion, fraud, and professional misconduct. Lauren and I sat through the hearings, listening as other victims came forward to share their stories. Each testimony was a painful reminder of the damage he had caused, not just to us but to so many others. But justice was finally being served. One afternoon, after the last hearing had adjourned, Lauren and I walked silently to the parking lot. The weight of everything we'd endured hung heavy in the air. Do you think it's really over? She asked, breaking the silence. I nodded slowly. For him, yes. But for us, I don't know. Lauren stopped, turning to face me. Her eyes were filled with tears, her voice trembling. Adam, I know I can't undo what I did, but I'm willing to spend the rest of my life trying to make it right. Her words were genuine, but they didn't erase the pain or the betrayal. I looked away, the weight of my decision pressing down on me. I need time, I said finally. Time to figure out what's next. For me. For Caleb. Her face crumpled, but she nodded. I understand. I hope you'll give me a chance someday. That evening, I packed a bag and left the house. Lauren didn't try to stop me, and for that, I was grateful. I needed space to think, to heal, to rediscover who I was outside the shadow of her lies. Over the next few weeks, I focused on rebuilding my life. I found a small apartment and started therapy, working through the anger and grief that had consumed me for so long. Lauren reached out occasionally, sending photos of Caleb and updates on his milestones. I responded politely, but kept my distance. One day, I received a letter from one of Dr. Bennett's other victims. Thank you, it read, for standing up to him, for giving us the courage to do the same. You've changed more lives than you'll ever know. The words brought a lump to my throat. For the first time, I felt a glimmer of peace, knowing that the fight hadn't been for nothing. Months later, I sat in my apartment, reflecting on everything that had happened. The betrayal, the confrontation, the revenge, it had all left scars, but it had also taught me lessons I couldn't ignore. Trust is fragile. Love is complicated. And sometimes, the only way to move forward is to let go of the past. As I wrote the final email to my lawyer, officially filing for divorce, I felt a bittersweet sense of closure. Lauren's chapter in my life was over, but Caleb's wasn't. I vowed to be there for him, no matter what. What would you have done in my place? Could you forgive someone who shattered your trust? Or is some damage too deep to repair? Share your thoughts in the comments below.